that is the Memorandum of Understanding, which I assume the US had to sign quite reluctantly, given that it reads as a, well, as a declaration of surrender almost. But again, I understand why it had to be signed, but at the same time, it's hard to imagine the US having to, being able to accept the terms of this. Again, the US has its own complicated political system, even though Trump recognizes that it's necessary to put an end to this. He doesn't necessarily have the final say or the only say in this matter. So I was wondering if you could speak to some of the domestic politics, how people in the United States are reacting to, well, what I would define as a defeat, at least.
Well, this was also a major political defeat for Donald Trump, and he's heading toward catastrophe. And that's why Donald Trump is trying to sell a different deal. There actually is no deal, but a different MOU to his base and to the American public than the one that Iran understands was agreed upon. Today, Donald Trump is declaring that there will be IAEA inspectors heading to Iran to inspect the nuclear sites. And that's something that Iran has rejected so far. And why would they accept that, given the assassinations of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the Oppenheimer of Iran, on down to lesser-known quantum physicists and scientists who were assassinated during the 12-day war. And afterwards, how did Israel get these names and put them in its target bank? Well, we know Israel hacked into the private accounts of Rafael Grossi, the general secretary of the IAEA, and it got these names through previous inspections that Iran had to hand over the names of scientists. So it doesn't seem like Donald Trump is putting forward the actual MOU to his own base that he has to sign, because the US was dealt the worst, I think, strategic defeat possibly in its history, military defeat. In many ways, a worse defeat than Vietnam, because the economic damage has not been contained and won't be contained even if the conflict ends right now. The situation going through the summer looks bleak, and I'm being told by people who are, investors, that oil is a really good bet right now because the prices will not stay down. So Donald Trump has to do this, and at the same in some ways he has won back. He's won back some of the support of his base. He's put J.D. Vance out as the salesman for the MOU. Vance was always sold to the public as one of the restrainers on Iran. He wasn't able to obviously do anything when Benjamin Netanyahu came to town and told Donald Trump, basically gave Donald Trump his marching orders in February. But now J.D. Vance is kind of having a little bit of a comeback. He's earning a little bit of his credibility back. Marco Rubio is nowhere to be seen. Donald Trump is backing up J.D. Vance publicly. But and Donald Trump is facing a rift within the Republican Party elite. The kind of George W. Bush neocon-oriented Republicans are up in arms about the MOU. The Israel First Republicans like Ted Cruz, Roger Wicker on the Foreign Relations Committee, they're obviously up in arms. And then you have like the Zionist movement that supported Trump, attacking him, including in Miriam Adelson's paper in Israel Hayom, the pro-Netanyahu propaganda sheet, which we can talk about next, is now going after Donald Trump. Donald Trump's unpopular in Israel suddenly. They're just so entitled that they would turn on him in a second. But I think one of the most cynical, insidious elements in American politics that is now attempting to turn the screws on Trump for signing this MOU and doing so in Versailles, the symbolism of signing basically a declaration of surrender in Versailles, are the Democrats. And the Democrats are doing so because the MOU is actually unpopular among the American public, not because they don't want peace with Iran. It's because they don't want Donald Trump to sign it, because Donald Trump is unpopular. Donald Trump is a widely hated figure, so anything associated with Trump is doomed to fail. This is like a new, I think it's a CNN poll, 64% of Americans don't like the MOU. That's almost the same number of Americans that didn't like the Iran war. So why wouldn't they want there to be peace? Why wouldn't they want there to be an MOU? Because it's Trump doing it. Everything in the news right now is not even like the top story in the US, if you watch cable news, is not the MOU. It's not the dynamics of the deal or whether Iran will actually give up its nuclear dust or submit to inspectors. It's about the reflecting pool on the National Mall and the fact that a former Olympian was arrested for dipping his hand into the reflecting pool because Trump has just overseen this absurd Mar-a-Lago style renovation of the reflecting pool that costs like $30 million. He gave the contract and a no-bid contract to a crony, and now the pool is filled with algae blooms. It's turned green. The blue sealant has cracked off, and National Guard are guarding the reflecting pool. And anyone who approaches can be arrested. And Trump is blaming vandals for the failure of this glitzy renovation project. And that's what everyone is focused on right now. Just it's become sort of a microcosm or a conduit for all of the public's contempt of Donald Trump. And that's flowing into opposition to the MOU simply because Trump is doing it. And that's a real problem. And then just, this is behind all of this, the political spectacle are figures like Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, uh, Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, all of these pro-Israel operatives whose careers have been fueled and instrumentalized by the Israel lobby or are just simply adherents of the Zionist movement. Jared Kushner actually brought Nick Stewart from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, which is the main Israeli cutout that devised this war in Washington. He brought him to Switzerland for the negotiations. So these figures are still honeycombed throughout the Trump administration and are poised to unravel any MOU or prevent a deal. But I think what they're doing right now is just buying time, and they see this as a form of strategic sequencing. So there are many factors working against the success of the MOU, even though the American public is just solidly against going back to war.
Yeah, well, what is said about Trump, speaking of a different MOU, I think it's quite evident, not just how he's, well, arguing that the IAEA has to come in, but he's arguing the US doesn't have to pay 10 cents. The MOU is quite specific. He's threatened Hezbollah to stop, well, what do you call disruptive behavior, I think. But it's the Israelis who are still occupying Lebanon. So all of these points in the MOU, and of course threatening Iran during the negotiation, this is also prohibited. So he doesn't appear to want to live up to it. Indeed, it does seem that he might be buying time, though, just to get some oil through stabilized markets. But it's hard to see this actually be implemented in full. How do you see Israel, though? It seems to be in a difficult spot now. That is, it's been pushing for this war with Iran for decades. It finally got its man in the White House. Trump did it, and then obviously did not go as planned. Iran has come out on top, despite all the death and destruction. But where does that place Israel at this point? I mean, how bad is the panic, and what's Plan B essentially?
Israel reportedly proposed to destroy all of Iran's infrastructure in 48 hours to the US, and the US rejected that because it's just something they can't do. I think, even the Trump administration, as buffoonish as they are, recognized that this was just another ploy to drag the US back into a war that it can't win, in which it achieved zero military objectives stated from the outset. And it was none other than the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Dan Kane, who opposed the war before it even began and began leaking to the Washington Post and the New York Times that the US would experience a munitions shortage, which it did. Dan Kane then testified for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I think in an exchange with Senator Dick Durbin, that Iran's Navy had not been destroyed and that the US could not militarily open the Strait of Hormuz. This was as Donald Trump he's even stating today, their military was decimated, the Navy's destroyed. It could be that that's what Donald Trump's being told in his echo chamber, but I think that's just the case Donald Trump wants to make to his base so he can continue to sell the MOU following this defeat. So the U.S. there's no clear way for the U.S. to achieve military objectives that it did not before, unless it's willing to commit massive amounts of air power and lose scores of planes, possibly get pilots taken hostage in order to destroy Iran's missile cities and deterrence. And it wasn't willing to do that. The war was fought through standoff munitions. Obviously after losing F-15s and an F-35 nearly being downed, the U.S. was unwilling to send in a lot of the air power that would have been necessary. And Iran has a very wise military doctrine that is based around, I was actually watching Iran's World Cup performance versus Belgium, and there was a clear analog, a clear parallel between Iran's strategy in that match and Iran's military doctrine, which is just based around survival. And that was such a wise doctrine against a U.S. empire that just doesn't have the political will to be able to even erode Iran's deterrence. There isn't the political will at home. There weren't adequate munitions. And so this leaves Israel alone. And now Israel is left more exposed than it has been probably at any point since the Suez Crisis and the 1956 war. And that means the Zionist movement is also exposed. And everything they say comes crashing against the hard rocks of the reality that the 99% experiences in the United States and around the world of economic calamity brought on by their war, and more and more people are waking up to the fact that this was essentially a Zionist war. Zionists don't understand this, though. They don't understand why everyone's mad at them. They actually see this as a form of persecution, as anti-Semitism. And they're not sharpening or honing their messaging. They're not able to cope with a popular mayor in New York City like Mahmoud Mamdani actually campaigning openly against AIPAC. More and more candidates in the US are campaigning against AIPAC. The level of opposition to Israel in Pew and Gallup polls is surging right now to record levels. It's like, I think over 80% of registered Democrats oppose sending aid to Israel at this point. The American public wants to cut Israel off. And the Israel's lobbying tentacles and the Zionist movement as a whole is not able to adjust its messaging or to cope with this reality. Within Israeli intelligence and the Israeli military intelligence apparatus, for sure, they are attempting to absorb some of the lessons of this war, but they won't have the firepower to confront Iran alone. And so the outgoing Mossad director, David Barnea, has leaked this details of what his Iran unit had been doing to generate regime change, and actually predicted that the Mossad would continue to escalate its destabilization activities inside Iran and its subterfuge, fawning to spawn regime change riots, and that they will actually achieve regime change by the end of the year. Again, I think this is another false prediction to justify, absurd prediction to justify their bureaucratic priorities and get their budget, and also to keep the U.S. mesmerized by the aura of Israeli intelligence. But again, this is they don't have a clear strategy there. I think Israel will press ahead, though, with destabilization activities. They may try to launch another war, perhaps after the World Cup, and assume that the U.S. will join them as they did during the 12-day war, to rescue them. This war would increase the pressure on Donald Trump to do something, and it's unclear. It's unclear if he will rescue them this time, or as Nixon did in the '73 war. But one thing that they have no strategy for, and that they're not prepared for, and which they cannot stomach at all, is the loss of support of the American public and growing elements within the U.S. political establishment. It's gotten so desperate that Israel's Channel 14, the pro-Netanyahu propaganda channel, hosted the Israeli magician and mentalist and fraudster Uri Geller, who declared that Donald Trump's brain had been hacked by a sophisticated electronic transmission by Iran, and that's why he signed the MOU. That really gives you a window into the thinking in Israel right now, and I don't even know if we can call it thinking.